Hello everyone, today we talk about Navarre before Navarre, at the roots of the Reconquista to some extent. This is not the first video in which I discuss Navarre, but it is really the one in which I discuss it per se. For the regional historical series, I want to talk about the Kingdom of Navarre that was in fact one of the most important principalities in Western Christendom. And that had an important role, especially in the early Reconquista. After that, say from the 12th to 13th century onwards, the country was also, for geographical reasons, mostly severed from the fort against the south. It was basically boxed into the Pyrenees between France and say other Iberian powers like Castile, Leon, and Aragon. There is a lot of competition, as you know, between these powers. We have, in fact, already highlighted it in those videos I made on Leon, on Castile, on Aragon. In the aforementioned video about the origins of Navarre, we coupled it with, in fact, the ones of Aragon and of and Catalonia. Specifically, we talked about Navarrese warfare, I think, also in one of the regional warfare series. So it's not like we haven't ever discussed Navarrese power in general. We actually already pointed out the very interesting, also military historical profile of the country, the fact that there is a bit of archaism from this essentially Basque background in the uplands, the Pyrenees, from one side, the slopes of the Ebro Valley from the other, and the very heavy Frankish influence on this warfare at the same time. It was a very heavy form of knighthood and feudalism, very interesting solutions from a technical panoplogical point of view that really are typical in many ways of the Iberian Peninsula, even as far as, especially between the 11th and 12th centuries, actually producing some solutions, some profiles that were ahead compared even to countries like France or Italy in terms of arms and armor production systems. However, Navarre has really a great importance in just the general balance of Western European power from, in fact, its foundation, the 10th century. But there is a before, right? There is something that you can also just conventionally give a chronological boundary to. Reason for which, as we've done also for other videos, especially ones of particularly important polities that had an important classical past in that regard. We've seen it mostly for the Italian communes. For Navarre, it's different. There is a Roman background, but there is, of course, a tribal one as well that really deserves to be discussed in order to understand where the Navarre stemmed from. Because we're looking at powers that historically sort of did not exist as such. You can actually see a great deal of Basque continuity. There is some marginal debate about this, but it's fundamentally about it. The centrality of Pamplona also from an early age as the center of Navarre. These are powers that, however, are truly formed, as among the powers that are truly formed in a just fully feudal sense. We will understand better how in the, say, full-fledged sort of Navarrese kingdom episodes, but you wouldn't understand that if you didn't look at the past of this land. So we are going to look, say, starting from very early in time to understand what's the deal of this, because when such compact polities existed also with a cultural legacy over the millennium, it's always important to highlight what fundamentals existed there. And it's also not the first time, for example, we looked at the Franco-Gothic frontier on both sides of the Pyrenees, also during different times from Merovingian to Carolingian times. A big chapter, of course, is the one of the Islamic invasions that did arrive to control up to these areas. We'll also have to talk about some taifas or other even older repetitions of the Caliphate of Cordoba, such as the Upper Mark, right, and the essentially convert, but still, say, in part Basque nobility that took on some roles within this administration. It was true for Aragon, but it wouldn't explain things like, for example, the famous Battle of Roncevaux. Actually, there were a couple of those, but the first one, the one of Roland, as you know, has a lot to do with the Basques, not much the sort of the Arabs, or essentially the Moors, this Arabized elites. Really, that in fact some of the Basques can be actually ascribed to at that point from a cultural, political, and even religious point of view, not mostly religious, but also in some cases. Now, when we look first of all at what would become the Kingdom of Navarre, this emerged in the essentially southern region of the Western Pyrenees, specifically in the lowlands around Pamplona, that, as you know, is located on the floodplain of the Akra River. This is a secondary tributary of the Ebro River. The origins of the settlement date back to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, in general, like not of the Kingdom of Navarre, of course, but you understand that this area that is fundamentally mostly overlooking the Ebro Valley, that, especially in its lower part, is actually a very open one to, especially the central Mediterranean. In fact, we would later become, it was colonized by the Alains, then it would be one of the most Romanized, we're looking at Catalonia essentially, right? The most Romanized areas in Spain, and also very connected with Gaul, via land for that matter. So Navarre is this more mountainous profile that also overlooks from the other side. In fact, Aquitaine, we'll talk now also about the differences between, say, the Aquitanians and the Vascones of classical times. We will also profile them better in a military sense, because you know that these populations were very difficult to subdue, even by the Romans. Not that, in fact, they didn't have the power to do so. If anything, there were also more peripheral areas. That's why they remained more or less on the outskirts of the major dominion of the plains, where really most resources were concentrated. But there is some warlikeness that leaves through the years, mostly because of a phenomenon we've seen in other mountainous parts of Europe, that routinely have difficulties to sort of provide food and look for the demographic exceedance and send these guys out there as war bands. This is true for every interland in every part of Europe, for that matter. And in the case of Navarre, it's relatively extreme, at least in the maintenance of a certain, toughness in law. And the settlement I was talking about before was the one of Pamplona, right? But of course there are so many, we often point at the foundation of a city in historical times, or because of some legends, whatever, but even famous cities, we know the exact foundation, actually were inhabited for much long before, so to a degree it's also relatively irrelevant, especially before urbanism, to stress so much since when certain places were populated. In fact, in this case, Pamplona is traditionally considered to have been founded as late as and by Pompey during the crucial time in the late Republic, because of different reasons, that is the one of the Sertorian Wars around 75 BC. At this time the Romans were coping with Mithridates, with Spartacus. The Sertorian rebellion, we will see it in other, it's a very fascinating chapter. These were essentially some Marian forces that had remained on the fringe after the Sulan Marian civil war, the social war in Italy, and so on, with a very interesting sort of Romanization, but also Celtization of the, respectively, of the locals, of the Celtiberians fundamentally, and the Romans that had remained in Iberia there, and that almost pushed back. In fact, say Sertorius was this Roman leader, came from central Italy, from Nursia, and say he could have simply pushed back Pompey, had been sent by the Senate to settle the matter in Spain, back to the sea. Had Sertorius won, of course, there would have not been some hippie sort of let's get free from Rome. No, Sertorius was a Roman and he was to rule there as a Roman, but he needed, of course, the Celtic barons to the degree. Of course, this would comply with the way, would actually exploit the situation for hopefully gaining more autonomy. But that especially by that point, Spain was fundamentally conquered by the Romans, except for the north that would hold out for a longer time until Augustus, fundamentally, that went there together with Agrippa to follow the wars against the Cantabrians and other Celto-Iberian or even Celtic, fully, say, to a degree, especially considering how intensely Celticized the Iberian north really was. They were, again, pretty warlike. Again, nothing specifically, these were people that knew very well how to exploit their own homeland, the local terrain. For the rest, it's not like they had any particularly developed military system whatsoever, but they were annoying, and we have seen, in fact, also in other videos, how annoying this north would remain for everybody involved ever since. Like the Visigoths tried to subdue the Basques, they failed. There were incursions from the north all the time. The same goes for the Arabs, right? The Reconquista essentially is born out of the same dynamic from the north. Then eventually the Christian kingdoms are established, and that dynamic stops also because they were technically the same people who ruled the south. It wasn't much of an issue in later times. But even in moments, I think about the Asturian background of Francisco Franco, like during the Spanish Civil War, and this sort of almost Celticism, almost Nordicism that came together with that sense of tradition, of tough breeds, of mountaineers, etc. In any case, that's a completely different context, nevertheless. So Roman geographers like Pliny the Elder and Livy, plus others, of course, noted that the area in question was inhabited by the Vascones. That would be the Basque people. And other related Vasconic-Aquitanian tribes. This was, it's debatable, but we think it were a pre-Indo-European ethnic group that spanned, at least this is certain, in that once ascertained that grouping territories from the upper Ebro River to the southern basins of the western Pyrenees. The Aquitanians, as you know, were mostly living in today's France up to the Garonne River. If you have hopefully countless times Caesar's Commentari, the Bello Gallico, the incipit, Gaul is separated in three parts. And from one side you have the northeast, the Belgians, so this technically Celt or Germanic people. In the mid you have the Gauls proper, the Celtic Gauls, and then in the southwest you have this Aquitanians. This is a different people, right? And Aquitaine also changed a bit, like in its historical boundaries from a political for political reasons, from antiquity to the Middle Ages. At some point we've seen it for the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse, that stemmed actually from the Diocletian reforms of the local provinces, even say part of the Mediterranean watershed, including, in fact, Toulouse were considered Aquitaine, but Aquitaine is properly just like the Atlantic side of the watershed, like from the Pyrenees up to the Garonne. That's it. Then, in medieval times, you have the Duchy of Aquitaine, that people call Aquitaine in general because it was the House of Aquitaine ruling over not just the duchy but lots of lands all around up to Auvergne and up to the Massif Central. And so people tend to think of Aquitaine, this enormous territory just south of the Loire River that had already been parceled out in Carolingian times like that, but that fundamentally was just a sort of feudal sum, right? You can't say that all those peoples actually stemmed from an Aquitanian background. Many were Gauls, like this, like Gallo-Romans from the older times. But I already made a video about I don't remember whether medieval Aquitaine or specifically Duchy of Aquitaine, but I think it was medieval Aquitaine because it was an overall sort of picture. And you know the story of Eleanor, the Angevin, so-called Angevin Empire, etc. But we will come back on that stuff in another bit. This is important because the Aquitanians are the northern and lowland neighbors of the Vascones. They are, in fact, much more warlike. The Aquitanian, these peoples were known for their hit-and-run tactics mostly, which is completely normal for essentially fringe areas, and also a particularly stratified society like Aquitaine was poorer than central Gaul, was much more florid, so they had lots of, say, horse skirmishers, right? You know, this is true for all these peoples. Think about the Cantabrians in the north, the Cantabrian Gallopal, that, you know, those ways of fighting a la Gineta that, in fact, we always point out not being really a Karl Farr consequence from the Islamic invasions, but actually something dating back to the millennium, of countries that, in fact, mostly had not much great compaction. The same Scipio, would be Africanus, was in fact quite, unimpressed with Celtiberian military qualities. They are great skirmishers, yes, but you know, if you meet them in open field, like they're done for. And we have already discussed some Celtiberian warfare, so if you're interested in that, you can check that out. This is what most people fail to understand, especially when it comes to the Celts. There is an incredible paranoia towards the idea that the Romans would have hidden who knows what kind of third millennium civilization of the Celts. No, the Celts had barely, like, they hadn't even reached urbanization. They were at large. There were some areas that were pretty rich and advanced for that late Iron Age, Central Western European reality, but at large they were underdeveloped people. And also by a big deal, and the consequences from a political and military point of view are evident by the great ease with which, especially the greater part of the Celtic world, fell to the Romans, and the rest is just, you know, the Romans didn't even care about that. It's a bit the case of Spain. It was a sort of Vietnam of Rome, except Rome won because there wasn't, in fact, again, much that these other peoples could oppose to her. So this region of Vasconia, so to say, I made a video about the Duchy of Gascony, by the way, which is another polity we will talk about in the end, which is, however, a bit of a different thing from the Basques per se. It's an area that the Merovingians would create as a buffer state in what would have been Aquitaine, so in the lowlands, to oppose the Basque raids. So it's a bit of a different thing. And again, if you check medieval France playlist, if you check the historical review, if you just search on YouTube for the Duchy of Vasconi or Gascony, I remember how I titled that on Schwerpunkt, you'll find it. So when we look instead at the Iberian hinterland of this area, the region aligns with what is now known as Navarre, in fact, western Aragon as well, northeastern La Rioja, and parts of the Bay of Biscay coast. Especially, you know, in the north of Spain, these are places could look like Cornwall or Brittany. They, in fact, had contacts in this Celtic fringe with the north, you know, even with Wales, with Ireland. We'll talk, if anything, better about this on some other occasion. Now, these tribes, these Basque tribes, spoke, in fact, the ancient form of the Basque language, often referred to as Proto-Basque by linguists, as essentially all those languages that either we know too few, because these people were barely any literacy, and or would eventually evolve into a more better known, say, medieval time language. Along with other related languages, including Aquitanian, which was used on both sides of the western Pyrenees in ancient Aquitania, in Latin, approximately between the Pyrenees and the Garonne, as we were saying, in what later became, in fact, Gascony that paradoxically takes the name after the Basque uplands that, aside from some, of course, raid and constant tribal instability, had nothing to do with the Aquitanian lowlands, right? And you have this Basque language spoken also in the southern valleys of the Basque country, to what is today the Basque country, before the Roman conquest, of course. So, to a fringe, of course, of the same Basque territory today. The Romans fully came to control the territory by 74 BC, when things are settled regarding the aforementioned turmoils. However, because you have the Romans conquering mostly from the south, as you know, and part of these territories are basically subdued. By the way, different tribes and clans had different allegiances. Everything was very fragmented. We just partially know about the details, but we do know that, of course, many of these people also sided with Rome, also in fighting against one another. It was the usual, tribes Rome relation in the conquest of continental Europe. In fact, unlike their northern neighbors, the Aquitanians, that were a bit more compact of a people, the Vascones negotiated a distinct status within the Roman Empire, right? There wasn't also this monolithic, lots of people still believe fundamentally that, empires are bad, like not which empires they are, what they do, where they are. No, they have this ridiculous dichotomy that not even a child, basically, I don't know, as a child personally, I understood this thing. It didn't take really much. But of course, some peoples were pro-Rome, others weren't, and at large, they were taken over and their elites Romanized, because there was no other way to control these places anyway. Especially the weaker tribes at times were actually against more powerful neighbors that sort of tyrannized them, would side with Rome to get their revenge in that way. Now, initially, this area was incorporated thus into the Roman province of Hispania-Citerior. So, initially, it was mostly comprehending the, say, northeastern Spain, like just the coastline plus like this interland expansion. Because technically, the Romans, by controlling the coastal towns, would fundamentally just control the hinterland as well. It's pretty obvious. There wasn't too much traffic going on on the Atlantic comparatively, so these peoples would fall unavoidably into the Roman orbit. Then this provincial rearrangements bring the Basque territory into Hispania Tarraconensis from Tarraco, as today is Tarragona. Eventually, essentially, under the administration of the Conventus Juridicus of Caesar Augusta, that is the modern Zaragoza. That's the sort of vernacular modification of Caesarian Augusta, like it was the originary center, right? The Romans bring a full urbanization into these lands that had previously not known, and they had opted as of some sort fortified hilltops, especially imagine how these places could be, say, in the 1st century BC, or even just, after a couple of centuries of Romanization, still very, still yet to be fully civilized areas. And the Romans, again, didn't even care too much about civilizing the far north that had, like, other parts, like, of the empire, like Armorica, this Celtic French, no need to be even directly Romanized, because they were dependent and subjected to Rome anyway. They had no escape. The Roman Empire profoundly influenced the region anyway, mostly through urban development. The Romans really bring in the big guns in terms of course, urbanization, roads, aqueducts. Doesn't matter how modest in the north, but still there are important traces of that. Rome instills that, as you know, in Gaul, in Spain, like a proper Italicization of the local language to begin with. The Basques actually maintain their own, but at large there are massive Latin influences in this all. The this country gets connected with the rest of the empire. It develops some industrial capacity. So it's a moment of opening, a foundation of a more common European intertwinement that the Romanity of the empire dramatically bolstered, especially in the West, right, as a truly now different fabric on its own. During the aforementioned Sertorian War, Pompey oversaw the founding of a city within Vasconic lands that were important to colonize, at large also to stop the usual raids like tribal infighting, like putting an end to all those incursions from the north, in fact leading to the establishment of Pompilo, the present-day Pamplona, constructed on an earlier Vasconic settlement anyway, because that was also the easiest thing to do. This is the traditional foundation of Pamplona, as we were saying before. The Romanization process prompted the Vascones to adopt Latin forms, leading, in fact, to the establishment of a new language in the area. It would coexist, in fact, with Basque, that is, the so-called Navarro-Aragonese one. This is a Romance language, once common throughout much of the Ebro River basin south of the Middle Pyrenees. As you know, Castile sort of, like in modern times, overwhelmed a bit like the other Iberian languages, just I don't know, the Langue d'Oil did in France, and therefore we don't have this spoken much anymore. However, the Basque language continued to be widely spoken at the same time. Imagine, especially Latin, is the language of administration. This is true also in other countries like Britain, like where Latin and some variants of it were spoken. It would continue to be being spoken to a degree, also informing some Celtic language. Think about Welsh and how sort of, Latin in Latin derived words it actually is. Whereas the rest of the populace, again, would keep speaking their own language, also because most of them did not really participate to the administration. They were peasants, as the majority of people in the world. They are living outside cities, especially in regions like these. Remember that the Roman Empire is grandiose in that sense, but not for the reasons that you're brought to believe. Technology, like just per se, like there is something much greater than that. That is also the actual coexistence of these different cultures within the same empire. These are all different peoples that at some point decide to start speaking, for example, a Latinate, a Romance language, which is something that could have not happened through enforcement with the means of the time. So it's all the more grandiose when looked in perspective, again, in a strictly also Western perspective. And because these peoples were really civilized at large, like the Greeks did not really need to be civilized, they needed to be commanded at large, and they would remain in their sort of fantasy of Hellenic bubble that, however, did manage to preserve its culture, even if it was Romanized and so on. But the West really started having a body in its own. So when you look at this rural and mountainous regions, of course, the process of Romanization was less intense, less necessary, and things went on fundamentally that way. After the Western Roman Empire's decline, the Vascones were gradually absorbed into the Visigothic kingdom. Again, the Vascones were still sort of could be understood in a cultural, linguistical sense, ethnically, a people on their own, but they weren't much of a strong polity per se, because again, they were fringe, marginal, and they could be a veritable pain in the behind, also for the Goths that, however, ruled across the Pyrenees, in Aquitaine, in fact, the Iberian Plateau, and sort of always nominally maintained control of the north, right? Even though this north really did escape a dire control from Toledo that had problems on its own. We documented the limits of the Visigothic monarchy that was basically controlled by the local council of bishops that in turn reflected the power of the Hispano-Gothic oligarchs that worked in order to keep it lay and ecclesiastical aristocracy checked. There were, however, especially at the beginning of the Visigothic kingdom, some vigorous monarchs that worked very much in order to actually strike back against these Basque raids that were, again, dramatically annoying. The point of these peoples is that you can always sort of exterminate them, etc., but you're never going to fully have any reason or motivation or resource to settle there, to replace the language, the ethnic fabric, and so they will periodically come back. This is true for the Celtic Fringe, a story of, if you look at Britain, if you look at any other place that fundamentally was too far, too inconvenient, to fully control that's what happened. So even though they're not really major polity, even as some secondary ones, the Suebic kingdom in Galicia, with also what is today's northern Portugal, these peoples were remaining like tribes. They had autonomized themselves at the collapse of imperial authority, but they also remained there. And under the raids, they were not an actively conquering people of some sort. The Visigothic kingdom, we made last year multiple videos on it. I'm always glad when we sort of stiffen that chapter in history in our playlist. Was often engulfed in civil strife, mostly because of the same reason for which the Frankish world really was. The Roman estates had shrunk, but fundamentally had preserved themselves. So there were these major magnates, landlords, that had a proto-feudal mentality that had heavily eroded public authority, like the unity of a sound dominion. And so it was very, 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 very difficult to control, even indirectly, the entirety of the kingdom. By the way, the north, again, was less appealing, so the efforts of Toledo were legitimately more concentrated, even maybe a close area like the lower Ebro Valley, downriver, or former Baetica, Andalusia, that was in part Byzantine for a while, and was, however, very difficultly reached by the Visigoths of the Meseta. The Basque leadership likely sought an alliance with the Umayyad Caliphate because of this very reason. This is also one of the astonishing things, that when you think about independentism and any kind of course, later historical, political, cultural issues that some people may have as minorities, whatever, that these things did happen, that these peoples did self-sabotage against, for example, the Goths, because they knew, at least in this case, it was partially more understandable because the Iberian Peninsula is huge, from a sheer geographical point of view, it's immense. So they understood that, say, if the Arabs were knocking at the door, they were looking from Ceuta to Gibraltar. It was yet to be, in fact, established in that sense from North Africa into Spain. This would have been trouble for the Goths, and as such, the Basques would have sort of profited for the collapse of the Visigothic kingdom, which was not a fair deal, at least because, as you know, the Arab conquest of Spain was overwhelming, to say the least, and Islam came to dictate its rule also on the Basques, with the same problems, really not fully directly controlling them, but still exacting lots of tolls, and say pushing them to cooperate, sending troops, participating to military expeditions in the north against the Franks. Here I'm also partially, we'll not actually skip it, but there is all the big chapter of the Frankish infiltration in northern Iberia that routinely happened because the Goths had these problems in the north, and the Merovingians were simply the stronger power. So they had the upper hand over the Pyrenees, which is something that France tendentially, also, whenever it was more or less politically compacted, tended to do. against Spain. The Basques were a bit the wedge, the tip of the balance here, and they were mostly weaponized, in fact, by the Franks against the Goths, right? So the Basques mostly supported that Merovingian power that also was, in its core, far north of the Loire, was also suppressing the Aquitanians that were, in this early medieval period, a sort of other nation compared to the Franks, very sort of more Romanized and, or at least having its own ethnic peculiarities. It was, in many ways, the perfect alliance, even though the Franks were quite bossy and toxic in their own ways, as we well know. Now, in any case, the Basques ally with the Umayyad Caliphate, right, to undermine the Visigothic stability. By 718, Pamplona had formed a pact with the Arabs that afforded it significant autonomy in exchange for military and political subjugation and tribute payments to Cordoba. In a Christian perspective, of course, they sold their souls to the devil, but at least they did gain some temporary autonomy. Cordoba was even further south, of course, than Toledo. So it was even less likely that troubles would have come from there on the longer run, even though, again, the Arab presence had itself felt also in the north. Evidence such as burial artifacts reveals strong ties with Merovingian France from an early age, as we were pointing out. This will really inform the local military that during the migration here, but mostly later, with, in fact, the aristocratization, the oligarchization of the early Middle Ages, tends to become something, in fact, more similar to Francia in a sort of feudal sense. This is also for the Goths, because as long as they existed, they, as we were saying before, were also the same mold of the Franks because of the local political and social balance. But the Franks have the upper hand in terms of feudalization in many ways. Made multiple videos about the military engineering behind the birth of, say, political and social, primarily, engineering behind the development of Carolingian cavalry, right? But remember that the Merovingians had already something pretty strong. Remember that everything the Carolingians had, the Merovingians had before. And just the Carolingians implemented and pretended they had come up themselves with it for the first time. But there was a lot of that battles in the pretty soon, like into Merovingian times, because as soon as they took over the Gallo-Roman world, they signed a pact with the local establishment. It was done. They had all those estates, etc. It was not like the Franks just come out of the forest, that instead actually did not have much of a feudal lifestyle at all. There is also a lot of connection at this point between the Basques and the Gascons of Aquitaine, along with items showing Islamic inscriptions as well. I made a video in which I explained the meaning, say the ecumenic meaning specifically, of the caliphal rule of Cordoba over the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula. That is distinctively a world on its own, and this is true for the entirety of the Middle Ages. It's really something different from the rest of Western Europe, and it's in itself concluded to an extent. It's really a different space, a different world. And Islam, ruling from the south, had this hegemonic ambitions that unavoidably brought through cooptation, exchanges, cooperation, etc., to especially the local elites siding with the stronger, and therefore partly becoming Islamic and or winking at them. We will see that there are lots of spontaneous conversions to Islam. Say it's difficult to say spontaneous because they were always under threat, but some of them were very exquisitely political. You find similar things in Armenia and other fringe areas. It was always more about the local divides, rivalries between clans than any sort of overall siding with a general sense of Christendom. This is especially true for the Basques to an extent, because at this point the banner of resistance against the Muslim, as you know, is in the Asturias that are just next door, but they're sort of more self-aware. Also, as a more developed system, they will foster further that that sense of also universal struggle within the Iberian Peninsula. We also have bigger ties with international players. Pamplona is opening to this game right now. It's sort of civilizing further, paradoxically, but it's also more provincial, more sheltered, more enclosed within the mountains. It was not unpermeable, though. In fact, we go as far as knowing that there was an Islamic cemetery in Pamplona, utilized over multiple generations, by the way. So this implies a Muslim military presence, at least in the period following the Arab invasions. Mostly the Muslims would operate like this. They were occupants in terms, like with military garrisons, not differently from what, say, the Goths have done. It's like, I don't know, you say the Ottomans in Bosnia, right? Such a wildly mountainous area that you can't quite control everything, the valleys, etc., but you can have here and there garrisons in some fortifications that basically signal that you're the authority, that you have the links with the southern markers of Islamic power, and that essentially act on behalf of Cordoba. And so that's a power to be reckoned with and to fear, really. Not that the average Basque mountaineer would care very much in terms of, he had already, like, getting killed was just normal part of his everyday existence. So if you added the Arabs into the equation, it wasn't that more tormented, right? But it's important to stress the brutality of these places. I mean, we're talking literally about the Basque countries in the 8th century. Nevertheless, the origins and establishment of the kingdom of Pamplona are closely intertwined with the southern expansion of the Frankish kingdom already under the Merovingians, but especially under their successors, the Carolingians. Because of that proxy anti-Gothic activity that the Franks were fostering in the Basque countries. Around 601, which is very early in time, right? The Visigothic kingdom is pretty strong, right? The Merovingians founded the Duchy of Gascony, right? It's spelled in different ways. VW, it depends on the Latin that was used at the time, provincial ways. The Basque have a completely different language from, say, the surrounding ones that are quite hard, quite unique, quite old, quite archaic. But of course, this place, as we've seen, it's also Romanized in language, like between Gaul and Spain. That's what you're going to speak. So, what is this Duchy of Vasconia? It's actually not in the Basque countries, but it's connected overall with it. Because, as we've seen in the video about the Duchy of Gascony, this is centered on the lowland, Aquitanian lowlands, and more specifically in that Roman area, so-called Novem Populania, because it counted 9 populi, so we're talking essentially local districts, right, at a village kind of level town, stretching from the southern Garonne River to the northern Pyrenees. So more or less what was the archaic, like older Aquitanian territory. And more, say, concentrated, at least in terms of these various populations, these various districts towards the mountains, because that's what the Franks were interested in. It was much easier to control the lowlands in the north. The sort of martial organization on the Pyrenees foothills had to be consistent because these savages sprang out routinely from it. It's not, that the Franks were in this period particularly delicated or provided with etiquette, like Gregory the Great is complaining at this time that the very Catholic Merovingians are still practicing human sacrifices. Never mind little detail, but just to be pretty graphic, like the Basques are far worse than that. And in any case, they have to be checked, they have to be controlled. Like the Franks already have issues with controlling the Aquitanians, the Basques can easily destabilize the area. And that's why, in fact, there is this sort of blend at this point in history between the Basques and the Aquitanians, because they have this shared hatred against the Franks, but at the same time they're sort of hegemonized by the Franks as well. There are Frankish counts coming to rule here, Frankish dukes, as we will see now. Now, the Duchy of Gascony was initially thus a Frankish mark aimed at controlling the Basques in a way or another. Because there would be some trade, some exchange. The Basques needed not just to raid, but to have some contact with the civilized world. It mostly had to do with Aquitaine from the other side was the easier way. The Gothic south was a bit more problematic, a bit more hostile. Also because the neighboring hinterland was a bit more primitive and brutal, with mountaineers and these military colonies, as the Basques themselves. The first recorded Duke of Vasconia was Genial, who held the title until 627. Subsequently, the Duchy of Vasconia turned into a frontier region. Again, we already discussed this in that video about the Duchy of Vasconia, but it's important to repeat it for the origins of Navarre. At this point, having a great deal of autonomy granted by the Merovingian kings, or better, like the Merovingian kings, as you know, towards especially the end of the 7th century, barely rule just 1/4 of the country. And the reason is that that's the peak of their political fragmentation. So basically, these dukes of Vasconia pretty much obtained a great deal of autonomy. This was the case for the Aquitanians before the Battle of Tours. Actually, the greatest accomplishment of Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours is not much the fact that they destroyed the Arab army, but the fact that they had previously let the Arabs fight against the Aquitanians and destroy them for them, so that finally the Franks could steamroll Aquitaine, taking it over without any problem, because this was a large people, and so pretty clever strategy, by the way. The Carolingian suppression of both the Duchy of Gascony and the Duchy of Aquitaine sparked a rebellion led by Lupo II of Gascony. This is important for a number of reasons. Normally, these martyr lords were giving problems. They were quite unloyal. At some point, they started calling Vikings. They were trying everything they could to remain autonomous, including self-sabotaging and making a mess into this territory that would historically also suffer from some external dependency of some sort. Think about the English later trying to escape the French. That's the first thing they had in mind. These names like lupus, it's interesting because it would point to some kind of course, this is a pretty Germanized, phase, post-migration era. You have, say, references to wolves, etc. But if you look at the Basque countries and if you look at tribal warfare, you'll find a lot of beast warriors of kind that truly had that primitive meaning also in their leadership, like the idea of being veritable wolves. Werewolves, we see that from Kiev to the Longobards, so it's not really strange. Now, in response to this revolt, Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, launched a punitive campaign in Aquitaine. We are between 760 and 68. It's actually a pretty long engagement that finally did quell the rebellion, leading to the division of the duchy into several counties governed from Toulouse. It was really the cornerstone of local dominance. The other center was Bordeaux-Bourdigala. Toulouse is on the other side of it's a Mediterranean watershed, but it had, we made a video recently about, in fact, the kingdom of Toulouse. They had this centrality. It had already been a capital of the first Visigothic kingdom north of the Pyrenees. The Franks, after Vouillet dislodged the Goths from there, that become, they moved largely in Spain, where they had already partly settled, but that had historically been the center. Toulouse, a very important Roman stronghold in a very strategic location, controlling the very watershed. Now, this place was controlled by the Franks, right? And they tried to strengthen, in fact, even the connections with these southern territories, sending quite trustworthy officials because they don't trust the locals. At the same time, the local officials, if in order to rule, they must give some concession to the local aristocracy. That is, however, somehow being co-opted, is ever more connected to an idea of Frankish rule. Similarly, to the east of the Pyrenees, the Marca Hispanica, so we were talking southeast of the Pyrenees, was established, as you know, along with the Marca Gothica, that would be Septimania, representing a Frankish effort to create buffer states between the Carolingian Empire and the Emirate of Cordoba. As you know, the Carolingians at some point across the Pyrenees, they invade, or at least they passing from Septimania, that was essentially the coastal area of the previous Gallia Narbonensis. In fact, with this, it was actually a very Romanized area, but since the Goths had retained control of this after the loss of Toulouse, the Franks called it Gothia, right? Because it was this is also the place where, I don't know, Benedict of Anian would come from. Like, there were places that were like others, like Italy, that were actually very Romance, but they also had a very strong Germanic identity at the same time from a political and institutional point of view. These are actually not very, say, statalized areas, but they are very urbanized, they're very Mediterranean, they're very florid, right? And Septimania was known as this, Septimania/Gothia, because it was said that you could cross it in 7 days of march, after which you enter the Iberian Peninsula proper, and here Charlemagne campaigns and establishes the Spanish mark, right, with Catalonia. And we made videos about medieval Catalonia, and you know how important it was, the Carolingian impression and the situation in these territories that, albeit being at some point overrun again by the Muslims, will maintain sort of a stronghold, strategic function, and would remain Christian, becoming eventually a bulwark of the same Reconquista against the Arabs, and effectively so contributing to destroy Islam in the peninsula. This is an important step because if you are in the Basque countries, now you see the Franks entering next door, right? Not being just in the north, but in the east as well. And you're ever more torn. Paradoxically, you become ever more important as the tip of the balance. The Basques do not like the Franks very much either, right? In fact, as we know, they will take up arms against them. During Charlemagne's reign, the Franks expanded their influence southwards, occupying various regions in the northern and eastern areas of the Iberian Peninsula. The level of Frankish authority in the same Pamplona during this time is not well documented, showing that likely it was feeble at best. And in 778, Charlemagne was invited by discontented Islamic lords from the upper mark of Al-Andalus, this military and administrative region in northeastern Al-Andalus, roughly corresponding to the Ebro Valley and the nearby Mediterranean coast, which existed as a marker area of Cordoba from the 8th to the early 11th century, to lead a military campaign aimed at seizing Zaragoza from the Emirate of Cordoba. This is quite interesting because you have essentially dissatisfied Islamic lords in the north that want to be autonomous from the same Cordoba, even at the risk of being exposed to the Christians, but in this sense cooperating with the bigger guy that can shelter them. Charlemagne would do that. Also later Reconquista leaders would really go as far as, as showing themselves, as it wasn't really normal in the peninsula, as protectors of the Muslims, of the Jews, because there was no other way to control it, considering the vast amount of Mudayyars that inhabited it. Things changed in the later Middle Ages, but at this point, imagine the situation. It's very messed up. Zaragoza is a large center in what is essentially Aragon, and conquering it means for the Franks like inflicting a very heavy blow to the to the Islamic authority there, right? Zaragoza on the Ebro is, say, just west of Tarragona, just south of Osca, right? There are these settlements also. Imagine this world that is literally in between, say, the Roman and feudal times. Like there is a very strong feeling there. Like Pamplona is even more within the Frankish orbit than these other territories, but for this reason, they had it already enough of the Franks, and they try to sneak out. In fact, this is the same year of the famous Battle of Roncevaux that occurred at the same shrinking of Carolingian power. In fact, Charlemagne's campaign on that year ended in failure, prompting the Frankish forces to retreat. As they withdrew, they destroyed the walls of the same Pamplona to undermine the city's defenses and deter any possible uprisings. This is really interesting in terms of, say, protection, again, toxic relations, etc. Like, you are nominally controlling these people, but you understand they are ready to revolt as soon as you leave. They will do it. So you raise their walls to the ground to undermine really their defenses, which will surely trigger someone at large. This is important because imagine Pamplona being the center of not just all the Basques per se, but the most important one. So there were lots of, cattle breeders out there in the valleys that didn't care about Pamplona. They thought they were a bunch of degenerates because that's where civilization is. We don't know what civilization is, but if Pamplona is weak in front of these other enemies, it's understood that the rest of the country will suffer of it. So the local establishment has enough leverage on the this Navarrese population to rise against the Franks. Right? The Franks had used similar strategies against other Christian cities, by the way, content under Cordoba's rule. So this triggers, of course, the resentment towards the Franks that are seen as invaders, as peoples that have really not much to do with the locals. They're foreigners. They're brutal. I mean, the Carolingians are really that brutal. They don't care. They really think they are the chosen people of God, and they just consider this Basque as lesser people, as lesser humans. Now, while crossing the Pyrenees on August 15, 778, the rearguard of the Frankish army, led by Roland, Charlemagne's paladin, was ambushed by Basque tribes in what became known, in fact, as the Battle or the Rout of Roncesvalles, of the Pass of Roncevaux, igniting some of the most beautiful epic literature in the history of mankind. Because of the sacrifice of Roland, rearguard positions were given just to the best elements, right? There are so many examples from the time, because the rearguard had to protect the rest of the whole. These guys fell, the entire army could be overrun, and Roland, of course, these are big armies, they stretch the Carolingian. We'll talk about Carolingian logistics and how big these armies were, what kind of forts were made, especially on such tough terrains across Europe, on the mountains. These are tough passes, etc. And Roland, basically, according to the legend, holds his ground to give time, essentially, to the rest of the army to get out in safety. He gets killed, and the Frankish rearguard was dispersed, but with its sacrifice saving, essentially, Charlemagne's forces. This is interesting because, of course, the story in the epos is that the Moors, the Saracens, do this. But as a matter of fact, these were actually Basque tribesmen, mountaineers, namely Christian, in part surely there were Muslims among them, as we've seen, among the very Basques, but there would be also surely some Arab advisors, some Arab unit, etc. These are traumatically primitive people to begin with, again, and they know their terrain. They know how to successfully ambush anyone passing there, every inch of these gorges, and they managed to take out some of the finest Carolingian elite force. Now, in retaliation for the Carolingian efforts to capture Zaragoza, the same emir of Cordoba recovered Pamplona and its surrounding regions. The sense is, you damaged us, now we are weak to begin with, so we'll give ourselves actually to the other side, which will soon become hated as well, but will at least capitalize upon this affront, like this defeat that we managed to inflict you, as showing you that we know how to hold our ground. These are moments probably in Basque identity that did mold ever more the local, say, sense of belonging, of political compaction, right? Because they were starting to act now in ever more independent ways. They realized they were in between these major powers that at some point would shrink back, and they more or less live always in the same place. They don't go anywhere. They don't need to, and they realize that by organizing better, they can make more leverage on these rulers. By 781, two local Basque leaders, Ibn Balasc, the son of Velasco, you see here, this is an Arabized name, but of a Basque name, right? And Mot bin al-Akra, also recognized as Jimeno the Strong, other case, were defeated and forced to accept subjugation. This means that just 3 years after Roncevaux, of course, the Basques were repenting of having, at least now, clashed against the Franks in such a heavy way, but it had been the Carolingians who had undermined their position to begin with. And so you have this bitter pages of Basque history in which it's a back and forth. The Iberian Peninsula really did suffer a lot of these Islamic incursions and their oppression. The next notable mention of Pamplona occurs, that's canny, right, for us to understand like what were these people doing, because Pamplona was really emerging now as the most important center there. And so if you know about it, you know more or less about what else is going on in the area. This happens when Mutarrif ibn Musa, thought to be the city's governor and a member of the influential Muvallad Banu Qazi family, were killed there by a pro-Frankish faction. Now, it's important to understand who these people were, because the Muvallads were essentially converts, right, Christian converts to Islam, right? And the Banu Qazi family was in fact a local Basque one that had done this in order to, in fact, it had been installed by the Muslims likely, so that there is a local faction that adverses them and that is subsidized by the Franks that of course are now coming back trying to help this faction against the pro-Islamic one. And the Banu Qazi family is very important as it gained considerable power and autonomy, especially in the mid-9th century, with its leader Musa al-Qazavi, known as the third monarch of Hispania, literally, because of, again, the relevance that now Pamplona really had acquired between the Frankish and the Islamic forces. And it also tells, in fact, here in chronological order that would stick around, right? The decline of the family arrives as late as the 11th century. So actually the Islamic garrisons in the Basque territory, the general ups and downs also of the various empires. Think about the Carolingians that fell, and later the relations between Cordoba and the Ottonians. That there is all sort of floating that forever goes on, especially in the frontier areas. The Basques are in the eye of the storm. But by this time, let's say the beginning of the 9th century, Basque territory expanded westward near the headwaters of the Ebro River with Einar's Vita Carolimagni, noting that the Ebro's source is in Navarre, which is not quite the case, because the Ebro's source is basically in Cantabria, near to San Giuliana, right, in Asturia, basically. However, it is true, and we've seen it in the video about the genesis of Navarre. We don't talk about Asturias there, but in the genesis of Asturias, but say that was an important player around. These local northern Iberian families were all intertwined. We started to marry into one another, giving each other essentially more substance, more power, and de facto fostering what had already been started since the end of the Visigothic kingdom as the Reconquista. It's remarkable that someone learned as Einhard, this Eastern Frankish biographer of Charlemagne, in his life, the most important one, speaks of Navarre in these terms, in this terms of territorial extension. In fact, this western area he's talking about, from a strictly geographical point of view, the source of the Ebro River fell under the sway of the kingdom of Asturias. The Franks renewed attempts, of course, to assert their dominance in the region. The empire had yet to reach its peak. We're still under Charlemagne's reign. In 806, the Carolingians, for example, placed Navarre under his protection. Following a truce with Cordoba, in 812, Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne, visited Pamplona, likely intending to establish an enduring county, although it was ultimately short-lived. The fact that, however, the heir to the throne of the Carolingian Empire could simply go to Pamplona shows how deep the connection with the Franks really was, how sort of relatively pacified the area was. And so even if the Carolingians do not manage to assert like a firm direct control, like they didn't even have it almost on some parts of Aquitaine, they could still show up in the Iberian Peninsula, and especially against the Muslims, and say, here we hold sway as opposed to you. By the way, continuous unrest in the Gascon lowlands weakened Frankish influence south of the Pyrenees for a long time, like enabling the Emirate of Cordoba to once again reclaim the area after especially Islamic victory in 816 at Pancorbo. In this battle, Balasc al-Yalaski, known as Velasco the Gascon, died, together with other magnates of the Basques. That really shows you, like, here also they were backed by the Franks, by the Duchy of Gascony, but there was this attempt to resist to the Islamic foe in common. The same here north of the Pyrenees. Louis the Pious dismissed Seguin I Lupo from his role as the Duke of Vasconia, triggering a rebellion led by Garcia Jimenez, who was killed, however, in 818. Louis the Pious was historically very connected with Aquitaine. He had been brought up there, and he essentially had very strong, say, connections in the region, to the point of being able to simply dispose of these leaders at his will. But this, of course, would trigger some rebellions there. These peoples wanted to be treated as, if not as equals, at least they felt that they could simply regain their own autonomy, and the connection between the Basque and the Gascons is intense, because they can back one another against these various foes, and or with greater force claim some further right. It's this point that Louis' son, Pepin, the king of Aquitaine, that's how important the region was for the Carolingian dynasty, quelled the revolt in Gascony and pursued the chieftains who had taken refuge in southern Vascony, especially Pamplona and Navarre, which were beyond Frankish control at this point, as we've seen. So this was a risky endeavor. An army was sent, commanded by Counts Eblus and Aznar Sanchez, the latter being appointed Lord but not Duke of Vasconia by Pepin, and they achieved their objectives in Pamplona, which still bore the scars from its destruction in 778. However, once again, during their return, the Franks were ambushed and defeated at Roncevaux by a force likely comprising both Basque and Cordoba-affiliated Muwallad Banu Qazi. So, this shows the incredibly floating nature of this Carolingian control over Pamplona and Navarre that at large were now hegemonized by Cordoba. In 824, yet again, the Battle of Roncevaux passed, so a coalition of Basque and Kazavi Islamic forces defeat a Carolingian military expedition. This pass was really, God-forsaken. Consider that the last battle occurred only 46 years after the initial engagement in 778. It shared similar features. The Basque assault from the mountains, of course, perfect ambush, a northward expedition by the Franks that are withdrawing from the country, and the same place, literally, the pass of Roncesvalles, or its vicinity, because it's not like, the sources tell us exactly where this happened. Because unfortunately for, of course, a medievalist military historian, it's always the point, like, where did it happen? Well, for the 8th century, we do not have, unfortunately, or for the 9th, like, the entire Carolingian warfare, remember, is tactically documentable, reconstructible in some detail for the Battle of Zunta, also one of the few Carolingian defeats. This was not a famous one, but it's like an ambush. We do not even technically know what happened. But this is the point. Just we can't hope to know more than much. We have an idea of how these fighters would have been. We will surely at some point cover also in the historical military unit series what a Basque warrior would have looked like. That didn't really change much from antiquity, right? Just a guy with a small round shield, basically no armor, some spears/javelins. This is the basic Basque warrior. Of course, there were mounted troops. Of course, there were armored troops. There were Islamic troops coming from the south. So it was, but we're talking about still, especially in this areas, particularly primitive realities that are simple but effective when properly exploiting the situation well. So the confrontation resulted in the defeat, also in this case, of the Frankish contingent, the capture of commanders Eblus and Aznar Sanchez, having more significant implications even than the earlier battle. Right, it was mostly chanted, sung by the later European literature because of Roland's figure, this Carolingian cycle. But the latter, in strictly political, historical, and cultural terms, contributed to the formation of the independent kingdom of Pamplona that really happened, in fact, just at this point, which we will see, however, in the next video that will be dedicated to essentially this high medieval history now of Navarre, and specifically of its realm that is founded at this point. That will historically expand fundamentally as an hereditary monarchy well into the later Middle Ages, and that would also in fact expand further, would be wars with neighbors, different kingdoms. So this was small, again, they would remain mostly encapsulated into the mountains, but for this reason difficult to take, difficult to destroy. In fact, they probably won at some point their independence back from previous defeats that really made say the heroic times of Navarre. We will talk about them. It's again just such a important, legendary, famous part of medieval history. I'm glad that we started sort of talking more in depth about it. We are sort of progressing with the Iberian Peninsula, because it's very difficult to talk about the Iberian Peninsula because every state has some, aside from the broader Reconquista dynamic that also further complicates things a lot, because there is a massive political, religious, cultural shift, right, and on the basis of the same territory. But it's we have 59. Okay, this is the 60th video on medieval Iberia, which I'll tell you, it's not too much, but I'm glad that we began to properly address, because it's such, again, a crucial topic that we should reevaluate a bit more in a general sense, like in a general historical fashion. There is always, of course, a lot to tell about these territories. The important is doing it well, doing it properly, which is unfortunately difficult to do. But this is the beauty of Schwerpunkt, I would say, that people sort of encounter probably my videos randomly, and they can access these other ones in a in that process. Like, people would fundamentally discover that along the way, like passing in all these various through all these various paths, right? Through the videos, through related ones, the recommended, the tagged ones, and again, there is a lot that we simply can't miss. Here I'm checking different stuff from also for other videos at some point. It's always sort of difficult to even find information. It's not easy. Again, there is always some sort of work behind it that is, generally speaking, taking its time. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.